art of second chances. Joan stood in front of his easel, brush hovering uncertainly over the canvas as the afternoon light streamed through the high windows of the community art centre. At 35, he'd finally decided to pursue his long-abandoned passion for painting, signing up for evening art classes after years of pushing his creative dreams aside for his corporate career. "You're holding that brush like it might bite you," a warm voice chuckled from behind him. Joan turned to find a man with kind brown eyes and paint-splattered jeans watching him with an amused smile. The stranger's dark curls were touched with bits of grey at the temples, and he carried himself with the easy confidence of someone completely at home in the studio. "That obvious, huh?" Joan replied, feeling heat rise to his cheeks. "I haven't painted since high school. Probably shouldn't have started with oils." "I'm Michael," the man said, stepping closer to examine Joan's tentative brushstrokes. "And there's no shouldn't in art. Though maybe I can help. I teach the morning classes here." "Joan," he offered in return, trying not to notice how Michael's presence made the studio feel suddenly warmer. "And yes, please. I'm completely lost." Michael pulled up a stool beside him, close enough that Joan could smell the faint scent of turpentine and coffee that clung to his clothes. "Show me what you're trying to achieve." For the next hour, Michael guided Joan through the basics of oil painting, demonstrating techniques with patient explanations and occasional gentle corrections. His hands were strong and sure as he showed Joan how to layer colours and create depth, and more than once their fingers brushed as they passed tools back and forth. "You're a natural teacher," Joan said as they cleaned brushes side by side at the sink. "How long have you been doing this?" Michael's expression softened with nostalgia. "About 5 years now. Made the switch after burning out in advertising. Best decision I ever made, even if my bank account occasionally disagrees." He glanced at Joan. "What about you? What brought you here?" "Divorce," Joan admitted, surprising himself with his honesty. "A year ago. Made me realize I'd spent so long being what everyone else wanted that I'd forgotten who I was. So here I am, trying to remember." "Brave," Michael said quietly. "Starting over isn't easy." Their eyes met in the mirror above the sink, and something electric passed between them. Joan felt his breath catch. "Listen," Michael said, drying his hands on a paper towel. "There's a gallery opening Friday night. Local artists, wine, pretentious conversations about metaphor and meaning." His smile was hopeful. "Want to come?" "As my guest?" Joan felt a flutter of anticipation in his chest. "I'd like that." They exchanged numbers, and Joan left the studio feeling lighter than he had in months. That night, he dreamed in colours. Friday evening found Joan standing before his closet, discarding shirt after shirt as his nerves mounted. He finally settled on a deep blue button-down that his sister always said brought out his eyes, dark jeans, and his best leather shoes. His hand trembled slightly as he adjusted his collar in the mirror. The gallery was housed in a converted warehouse, its brick walls hung with canvases that glowed under careful lighting. Michael was waiting outside, looking devastatingly handsome in a charcoal blazer over a black t-shirt. His face lit up when he saw Joan approaching. "You came," he said, as if he'd been worried Joan might change his mind. "Wouldn't miss it," Joan replied, trying to ignore the way his pulse quickened when Michael placed a hand on the small of his back to guide him inside. They wandered through the exhibits, glasses of wine in hand, Michael offering insights about technique and composition that made Joan see the artwork in entirely new ways. His passion for art was infectious, and Joan found himself completely absorbed in their conversations. "What do you see?" Michael asked as they stood before an abstract piece, all sweeping gestures and bold colours. Joan studied it thoughtfully. Movement, freedom, like someone finally breaking free of constraints. Michael's eyes sparkled. Exactly what the artist intended. She painted it right after coming out to her family. Their shoulders brushed as they stood contemplating the painting, and Joan felt a current of awareness run through him. When he glanced at Michael, he found the other man already watching him with an intensity that made his breath catch. Want to get some air? Michael asked softly. They made their way to the gallery's small courtyard, where string lights twinkled overhead and the evening air was cool and fresh. They found a quiet corner away from the other patrons, and Michael turned to face Joan fully. I have a confession, he said, setting his wineglass aside. I don't usually ask first-time students to gallery openings. Jones. I have a confession, he said, setting his wineglass aside. I don't usually ask first-time students to gallery openings. Joan's heart began to race. No? No. Michael took a step closer. But there was something about you. The way you looked at that canvas, like you were seeing possibilities instead of limitations. I couldn't stop thinking about it. About you. Joan swallowed hard. I haven't been able to stop thinking about you either. The admission hung between them for a moment, charged with potential. Then Michael's hand came up to cup Joan's cheek, and time seemed to stop. May I? Michael whispered. Joan answered by closing the distance between them. The kiss was gentle at first, a careful exploration that quickly deepened into something more urgent. Michael's fingers threaded through Joan's hair as Joan gripped Michael's hips, pulling him closer. When they finally broke apart, both were breathing heavily. Wow, Joan managed, resting his forehead against Michael's. Michael laughed softly. Yeah, wow. They spent the rest of the evening in their own world, sharing stories and stolen kisses in the courtyard. Joan learned that Michael had grown up in Seattle, had a golden retriever named Vincent, after Van Gogh, of course, and made terrible puns when he was nervous. Michael discovered Joan's secret talent for origami, his collection of vintage vinyl records, and his childhood dream of becoming an astronaut. As the gallery began to empty, Michael took Joan's hand. Let me walk you home. The night air was crisp as they strolled through the city streets, their fingers intertwined. They took the long way, neither wanting the evening to end. When they finally reached Joan's apartment building, they lingered on the steps. I had an amazing time, Joan said, still holding Michael's hand. Me too. Michael stepped closer, his free hand coming up to trace Joan's jaw. Would you like to have dinner with me tomorrow night? I make a mean risotto. I'd love to. Joan leaned in for another kiss, this one slow and sweet, with promise. When they finally parted, Michael's smile was radiant. Good night, Joan. Good night, Michael. Joan watched him walk away, his heart full and light. As he got ready for bed that night, he caught himself humming, something he hadn't done in years. His phone buzzed with a text from Michael. Already counting the minutes until tomorrow. Sweet dreams, artist. The next few weeks passed in a blur of dinners, gallery visits, and lazy Sunday afternoons in Michael's sun-filled studio. Joan discovered that Michael really did make incredible risotto, but burned toast without fail. They painted together, Michael teaching Joan techniques while stealing kisses between brushstrokes. Sometimes they would just talk for hours, sharing hopes and fears and dreams. 1 month into their relationship, Michael suggested they take a weekend trip to a small coastal town known for its artists' community. They rented a tiny cottage overlooking the ocean, spending their days exploring galleries and their evenings walking on the beach. On their last night, as they sat on the sand watching the sunset, Michael turned to Joan with serious eyes. I need to tell you something, he said, taking Joan's hand. Joan's heart skipped a beat. Okay? I'm falling in love with you, Michael said simply. I know it's fast, but I've never felt this way about anyone before. You make me see the world differently, brighter somehow. And I just needed you to know that. Joan felt tears prick at his eyes as joy bloomed in his chest. I'm falling in love with you too, he whispered. Michael's kiss tasted of salt air and happiness. As they drove back to the city the next day, Joan reflected on how much his life had changed in just a few short weeks. He'd started taking more advanced art classes, had begun to experiment with different styles and techniques. His apartment now held several of his own paintings, including one of Michael sleeping in the morning light that he'd created from memory. More than that, he felt like himself again, or perhaps for the first time. Michael encouraged his creativity, challenged his perspectives, and loved him with an openness that made Joan want to be braver in every aspect of his life. 3 months into their relationship, Joan decided to take a leap of faith. He'd been considering leaving his corporate job for months, drawn more and more to the idea of pursuing art full-time. When he told Michael his plans one evening as they cooked dinner together, Michael's face lit up. "You should do it," he said, abandoning the vegetables he was chopping to pull Joan into a kiss. "You're too talented to spend your life in meetings." "It's terrifying," Joan admitted. "Starting over at my age." "The best things usually are," Michael replied, his eyes full of love and belief. "And you won't be alone. I'll be right here, cheering you on." 2 weeks later, Joan submitted his resignation. That evening, they celebrated with champagne in Michael's studio, surrounded by half-finished canvases and the smell of paint. "To new beginnings," Michael toasted, clinking his glass against Joan's. "To finding ourselves," Joan added, "and each other." As they kissed, Joan marveled at how life could change so completely in the space of a few months. He'd walked into that first art class feeling lost and uncertain, and now here he was, embarking on a new career with the man he loved by his side. That night, as they lay tangled together in Michael's bed, Joan traced patterns on Michael's skin and thought about the nature of art and love. Both required courage, he realized. The courage to face a blank canvas, to make that first mark, to trust in the process, even when the outcome was uncertain. "What are you thinking about?" Michael murmured, pressing a kiss to Joan's shoulder. "How grateful I am that you decided to help that hopeless beginner with his oils," Joan replied, smiling in the darkness. Michael pulled him closer. "Best decision I ever made." 6 months after their first meeting, Joan held his first small exhibition in the very community centre where they'd met. His paintings, abstract expressions of emotion and transformation, hung on the walls where he'd once stood as a nervous beginner. Michael was by his side throughout the opening, beaming with pride as Joan discussed his work with visitors. When they were finally alone at the end of the night, Michael led Joan to stand before his favourite piece, a swirling composition of blues and golds that seemed to dance across the canvas. "This is my favourite," Michael said, wrapping his arms around Joan from behind. "It reminds me of that first day in the studio, watching you discover your love for painting." Joan leaned back against him, content. "You gave me back my dreams," he said softly, "or helped me find new ones." "You did that yourself," Michael corrected gently. "I just helped you hold the brush." As they stood there together, surrounded by the physical manifestations of Joan's journey, he thought about all the twists and turns that had led him to this moment. The end of his marriage, which had felt like a failure at the time, had actually been the beginning of his true life. That first tentative step into the art studio had led him not only to his authentic self, but to a love he hadn't known was possible. "Move in with me," Michael said suddenly, turning Joan to face him. "My place is bigger, has better light for painting, and most importantly, I want to wake up with you every morning." Joan felt his heart soar. "Yes," he said, pulling Michael into a kiss that tasted of promise and forever. "Yes, to all of it." Later that night, as they lay in bed planning their future together, Joan remembered something Michael had said on that first day in the studio.